So let's consider adding a player and also consider how we're going to move that player around so that he doesn't walk through blocks. Now these prefabs, they will have a collider. Now I could create a player character with a character controller, but I think in this case it'd be quite easy enough just to use a rigid body on a game object. So yeah, let's try that. Okay, so game object to create other. Could make it a sphere, but I think it'll be a little bit funny looking as it walks around corners. Alright, let's start with a sphere. Name it player. 0 the position. That's where I like it. Okay, sphere collider, mesh renderer. Need a rigid body component. Let's just create the script. So player script. Highly original name. Player script. What is now the 24th? Okay, so done this before in my other series, but when I attach this script, I want to make sure there is a rigid body component because this script depends on there being a rigid body component. So, and this script requires component. Require component type of rigid body. So when this script gets attached to something, it'll automatically give it a rigid body component. Now let's store a reference to that rigid body. My rigid body of type rigid body. I'll look up my spelling is right. Okay, and we want to cache that in the start. So let's just say my rigid body equals rigid body. Okay, while we're setting up the rigid body, let's set the constraints again in case we forget to do anything in the inspector. I want to make sure through script that the rigid body is set up correctly. So my rigid body is kinematic equals false because that's a new one. Because I don't want my rigid body, I do want my rigid body to be affected by other colliders. I don't want it behaving on its own. And my rigid body use gravity. Now I'm working this whole thing on the vertical, so I really don't want gravity on. So rigid body gravity equals false. Now finally, because I am using a game object, the rigid body, let's set the freeze constraints. Yes. My rigid body freeze rotation equals true. So I won't start rotating and doing silly things, especially when I start putting a texture on it or even make it a model with an animation or something. We don't want it spinning around in funny directions. So we'll freeze the rotation. Okay, so there's the rigid body part set up. Now, are we going to be moving the rigid body at a speed variable? Let's just start at 5, see how fast he moves around. Okay, so we're going to be taking some inputs, and from that input we're going to be calculating a desired velocity, because when we set anything to do with rigid bodies, we need to do them in a fixed update. So let's set up a variable for our desired velocity. And let's just assign it a default value of vector 3, 0. So he's not going to be moving the start. So what's all that for? My rigid body dot velocity is going to equal desired velocity. So we need to do some calculations to work out what our desired velocity is going to be to apply it to our rigid body's velocity. So let's get some inputs. Let's just store them in some variables. Variable horizontal of type float equals input get axis. This is going to be storing our horizontal axis input, and let's create one for the vertical as well. Okay, so we're receiving inputs from the keyboard or from a joystick, hopefully, which would be fun. And now we need to calculate the desired velocity. Okay, so desired velocity equals vector 3 because we're doing it to velocity, we don't need to multiply it by a time factor, so it's just the horizontal input times the speed, and then the vertical input times the speed, and I don't want any movement on the z-axis, so I'll keep that at a 0. Now I know in past videos I'll keep mucking up what I'm saying. Yeah, x, y, z. I think I said x in one of my other videos for there. But yeah, nothing is happening on the z, everything is positioned on the z. I don't want any movement on the z. Actually, that is pretty much the whole player movement part looked after. So let's see what's happening here. So we have our player. Let's drag on our player script. Now we should have the rigid body component attached. Now you can see it's set to use gravity, but I didn't want that. So just imagine, and I also wanted to freeze rotations. You see, so imagine I've totally forgotten to set up my rigid body component. Now in the start, if I hit play, all should be happy there. See, use gravity is false, is chromatic is false, freeze rotation true. So he's probably going to move. He's probably going to do silly things there. Okay. Looks like he's sitting in front actually. Oh yeah, so when we instantiated we pushed it forward. Alright, so let's get our level manager script to look after the player. Make sure he's in that position that we made sure that we left empty at the start. Okay, so there's some variables. Player. Okay, so variable player, which will be of type transform. Now, let's check if we have a player at the start. So we want to set the player position here. So if we don't have a player in the inspector, let's just find him. Player equals game object dot find, and it was named player with a capital P. Game object find player, and we are accessing and storing a reference to the transform. Okay, so now we definitely should have a reference to the player, unless it's not named player. So let's just set the player dot position equals vector 3. Now what did we say it was? It was 1, and then it was level size minus y minus 2. So this is our player position here. 1, our level size minus 2, and 0 on the z. Everything is 0 on the z axis. So we have our player, and then we build our level. Okay, so the level manager is going to find the player and it's going to position it in that empty space that we've allocated on our randomly generated map. Let's see it all happen. I've made changes here. Added the script, so I save the scene. I hit play. Okay, and there's our player up in its allocated position, and it's set up pretty much like I was describing. So if we were starting off here, so he'd move to the right, he would drop his bomb off here, and while it's fusing, he would hide down here, and the bomb would blast that way, and he's nice and safe, and he'll be able to move over there and keep going. So there is a slight bounce there, but otherwise, that's what I was worried about, him looking a bit funny going around the corner as a sphere, but no, I'm pretty happy with that. That's okay. That's fluid movement. I suppose we could test it here. What if we added a... we're rearranging the components. Component, physics, what if we made it a box collider? I hope it doesn't affect the prefab. Yeah, it's actually more chunky if you don't get a... yeah, okay, so that is actually not cool. I think I made the right choice with a sphere collider. Please tell me I didn't change that. Yep, sphere collider, awesome. So now, beauty, got some space. Okay, so now we have our player ready to start destroying things in the level. So I suppose it's all well and good in the scene view, but the game view, nothing much is happening here because the camera's all in the wrong spot. So we better set up the camera so we can see the screen. I could make the camera orthographic, but I kind of like the 3D idea. I kind of like the idea of the walls showing their sides as we move around. So I am going to keep it a perspective camera. And I'm going to move the camera in position to the player, but not so the player's always in the middle. I want to have it so the player will have some free roam like that, and if the player gets too far to one of the sides, then we'll start scrolling the camera over. So let's set up the camera script next.